Welcome back to Coding Shorts. I'm Sean Wildermuth. With C#11 and .NET 7 around the corner, I thought I'd dig into some new features. Starting today with a C#11 feature called Generic Attributes. Interestingly, a lot of people have asked for a long time why attributes are so special and don't support generics. Well, Microsoft has remedied that and now supports generic attributes. How they work and why they work is a little interesting because of the nature of attributes. Let's see it in action. So here I'm in Visual Studio Code, though we could certainly do this in Visual Studio as well. And I have a small project that does some specific things. If I look in the program.cs, you can see that I'm using this to get a validator for a person object. I'm creating a new person object and then trying to test whether this validator is valid. And I do it again with a different person object with my name in it. Now this get validator is kind of interesting because we're using reflection to get an attribute. And that attribute is called validator attribute. And this is one that takes in the type of the validator class that we're going to go ahead and instantiate to use as our validator. And finally in models, we're wiring that up here by passing in the type that does the validation for this class. And all this works exactly the way you would want to. The big change here is in C#11, it's going to allow you to have generic attributes. And what does this mean? This means what we'd like to do is change this from a type of to just including the validator here. And here it's going to complain because it's preview and unsupported. I'm using preview 7 of .NET 7, and so these are unsupported right now and in preview, and what we have to do is actually go and turn on enable preview features in the current builds. This may become default when we get to release, but in the previews, we need to turn it on. So once we do that, it's going to support it, but it's going to go, you know what, this validator isn't generic. So we have to fix that. So this has a lot of pieces to it in order to get this information. We can actually really simplify this. I'm going to say attribute T and get rid of all of that because the attribute itself, the type that's defined here, is going to be what stores itself as that metadata. So I don't need to have the access of this. I'll be able to get the T by looking at the type of the validator attribute. In fact, over here, we're now seeing just a person validator. Now that we've changed this to be a generic, how do we then change our code in here to get what we really need? Now this validator attribute expects the information is in the generic parameters. And so what we're going to look for here is actually not type of validation attribute, but validation attribute with no parameters in here. We're looking for the type of that finds it with a single generic parameter. And so when we get this, if this isn't null, what we're really trying to do here is instead of getting the validator type, which was a property on that interface originally, we look at the get validator, it's not going to give us any help because we don't actually know what that is. Instead, we're going to get its type, then we're going to say generic type arguments first. So I want the first argument in the type that represents the parameters in that, because what I'm really looking for is this guy. I want to be able to generate a validator for this specific type. And so once I get that, we're going to get all the information here. We have that validator type, but there's going to be an error here. We can see it over here in the design that there's a line there. So let's break this up into separate lines so we can see it a little better to see what's happening. In this case, I'm asking it to get it as a validation attribute, which of course we've added types to. So we don't actually need to cast this here because we're going to get an object here, but we're just going to call get type to get the underlying type anyway. So we're going to get that, again, this validator attribute being one that contains one generic parameter is all we need. And then we're pulling in that parameter here. And so let's try to run it. We can see that it's getting those types and returning them valid. So the code to actually get the generic attribute isn't that different. But remember that this ends up being metadata. So it's not a runtime, but this is a compile time constant. And so it does limit some of the things we do, but I'd like this to be a little bit more powerful. I'd like us to use those constraints. And so let's go back over to our attribute, because this is where the real power of using generic arguments comes in, is we can tell it what we want it to do. And what it wants is a validator T, right? But we have a problem. This T represents the validation type, not the type that the validator is for. So we can go ahead and add a second T, let's call it T entity, and make that work, right? And it's complaining because we also have to specify that this needs to be a class. So in this case, T is both a class and involves that interface. And we then can go ahead and set its defining attribute as well, which is it's also a class. And so what this allows us to do is force here that this is a person validator that validates a person. So not only does this validator have to be a class, it has to be a class that validates persons. All this code ends up being the same, except we need a comma in here because we're telling it that we want an attribute type here that takes 2 parameters, because of course we changed it over here. But all this little magic we're putting in here, and let's go over to the iValidator class, and we're going to want to do the same thing here. And you'll see here that it's already defined this has to be a class, and we could actually make that more powerful if we want to. And then when it's implemented, it's going to have that certain piece. And this is still going to work because the only argument we care about is the first type argument, which is the actual name of the person, so that we can create an instance of. Now, this may not always be what you need or what you want here. You may not be creating an instance of, you might be reading it as some sort of metadata, but it still is going to be handled in exactly the same way. Now we've made those changes, let's run it again. Still works, but now we have compilation time benefit, because if I put in here object, this is going to fail. Why? Because person validator doesn't implement iValidator for object, it is an iValidator for person. And using our generic arguments here allows us to further concrete, so that if there are changes made, like this is no longer for a person, but for a subclass of person, you'll know that it fails during compilation, way early in the development cycle. And this is one of the main reasons they're now supporting it. It isn't overly powerful because attributes are sort of special in that they are stored as metadata. So you can't do more interesting things like have a generic type that will have a lot of instance data to it that might be different, because everything needs to be convertible into a constant. But this change does allow for some scenarios that were more difficult before. You really had to test at runtime instead of compile time. Thanks again for joining me for a coding short. This has been Sean Wildermuth, and thanks for subscribing and liking the video. See you next time.